Hi, good afternoon, everyone, and welcome to today's IDRA meeting, Diversity and Indigent Defense Research. I am Kenitra Brown, the staff attorney and an adjunct professor of law at the Deason Criminal Justice Reform Center at the SMU Detman School of Law and the moderator for today's meeting. Before we start our discussion, I want to provide you all with a few ground rules and expectations for today's conversation and reiterate, as your moderator, I'm here to guide the conversation because we want you to hear primarily from our panelists. So think of this meeting as a conversation with opportunities to gather insights to shifting your thought processes and frameworks and thinking about what you hear today, how that can improve or supplement your working or organization environments. In a meeting setting like this, I'd also like to lay out expectations and assumptions so that our postures are open rather than defensive. In accordance, we accept that we are all good, well-intentioned people who are trying to grow, and we respect where everyone is in their development and understanding around all types of diversity, race, ethnicity, age, ability, sex, gender expression, geography, etc. But the expectation is that you're open to hearing perspectives from some of the most thoughtful and impressive minds in this field and in this space. Our hope is that our panelists can also be straightforward, vulnerable, candid, and open about not just diversity in indigent defense research, but belonging, inclusion, and most importantly, retention in the space and in the IDRA organization. We ask that you listen with openness and that if you have questions or comments, to please be respectful, thoughtful, and helpful in your responses, and what we hope is a lively and constructive conversation. And I'm going to introduce our panelists in alphabetical order. This is not an indication of anything other than it's just easier to do it alphabetically. Our first panelist is Dr. Venita Embry. She is a violence and justice researcher within the Center for Courts and Correction at RTI International. Her expertise spans public health and criminal justice areas to include violence prevention, and my page is not moving, and intervention strategies, child maltreatment, behavioral health services, pretrial decision-making, collateral consequences of justice involvement, and court systems and programs. Using both quantitative and qualitative methods in her research, she currently directs multiple projects that provide technical assistance to public defense counsel and evaluates prosecutor-led diversion programming. She's also worked on several projects for the National Institute of Justice, the Bureau of Justice Assistance, Centers for Disease Control and Prevention, and Substance Abuse and Mental Health Services Administration, as well as a variety of local government agencies and foundations. Professor Alexis Hoag-Fordjour is an assistant professor of law and co-director of the Center for Criminal Justice at Brooklyn Law School. She teaches and writes in the areas of criminal law and procedure, evidence and abolition. Her scholarship interrogates the policies, doctrines, and practices within the criminal legal system that erodes people's constitutional rights and perpetuate racial subordination. Before joining the Legal Academy, she spent more than a decade as a civil rights and criminal defense lawyer, primarily representing capitally convicted clients in federal post-conviction proceedings with the NAACP Legal Defense and Educational Fund and the Office of the Federal Public Defender in Nashville, Tennessee. Professor Irene Joe is a professor of law and the Martin Luther King Jr. Hall Research Scholar at UC Davis School of Law. She teaches in the areas of criminal law, criminal procedure, legal ethics, and jury selection. Her research focuses on how the design of the criminal process affects the ability of institutional attorneys to manage overwhelming caseloads and comply with ethical requirements. Before joining UC Davis, Professor Joe served as a fellow for the Equal Justice Initiative of Alabama, where she represented indigent defendants in capital post-conviction litigation and children sentenced to life in prison without the possibility of parole. She was also the assistant training director with the Louisiana Public Defender Board, where she was responsible for creating and implementing statewide training procedures and programs for public defenders, investigators, mitigation specialists, and other administrative staff. And finally, Sruithi Naraharisetti, is the Senior Research Associate at the Center for Court Innovations Policy and Research Department. Her work focuses on developing mixed methods research, translating research evidence to practice, and contributing to policy-level reform. Her work currently supports various national initiatives, including with the Bureau of Justice Assistance Sixth Amendment Training and Technical Assistance Program, Arnold Ventures Advancing Pretrial Policy and Research Organization, and Pretrial Justice and Intimate Partner Violence. Prior to joining the center, She worked with poverty solutions at the University of Michigan, where she conducted mixed methods research with a focus on racial, economic, and criminal justice, and provided data-driven technical assistance to governmental entities and nonprofits. Thank you to all of our panelists, and thank you in advance for your openness and your thoughtfulness in answering our questions today. We're going to start with a basic question. Oh, it's not a basic. We're going to start with a question about what the priority should be for empirical research in indigent defense. And we're going to start with Professor Joe. And we can feel, after Professor Joe speaks, either of you can feel free to jump in. And if not, I'm happy to call you out.
Thank you so much, Kenitra. Let me start by just saying thank you to IJA for having this event. I think, you know, as many of us know, IJA has been very critical and important to sort of the growth and establishment of, you know, scholarly thought about indigent defense. And so it's exciting to see that you're exploring and interested in ways of making that all richer. You know, okay, so the priorities for empirical research in indigent defense. I feel like if you ask any scholar, they're going to have a different answer depending on their own particular interests, right? And so I'm going to, you know, take the benefit of being the scholar you've asked first and say that when I think about the priorities going forward, I think it's really important to consider how the attorneys or the support staff or anybody who's doing the work is best situated to do it in a way that's meaningful and long-term. And part of that includes exploring how the work affects different participants based on their race, right? You know, we recognize, right, that the racial bias, both explicit and implicit, influences and impacts the law, right? We understand the research about that. We recognize the importance of doing research about that, but we don't quite ask as many questions about how racial bias, both explicit and implicit, impacts the ability of certain attorneys to do the work the way that we want them to do it. And so that's one of the areas of empirical research I'm really looking forward to doing myself. I'm excited to see other scholars pursue, because I think that'll take us a long way in understanding the problems that face indigent defense right now and hopefully devising solutions going forward that would greatly improve things.
Yeah, I echo Professor Joe, or Irene, if I can call you in that context. But also empirical research only takes us part of the way. And I think it's, you know, a powerful tool looking at the legal system as a whole. I think it's been really critical in having this discussion about the lack of funding for indigent services, the delivery of services, but sussing out racial bias, sussing out racism is often a slippery thing to document. And I found some of the greatest, most impactful research that I've encountered as I sort of developed my scholarly voice in this arena is qualitative research. And so Matthew Clare's voice has already come up. He's a really incredible sociologist, not trained as a lawyer. Nicole Van Cleve as well, just high quality qualitative research in Suffolk County for Matthew, in Cook County in Illinois for Nicole. But I found that our legal system can be quite deaf to the empirical research that we've put forth. And I think principally of McCluskey versus Kemp, right? This is this case that many of us who teach adjudication, you know, touch upon, but showing sort of this gold standard empirical research to the U.S. Supreme Court about racial discrimination in the deployment of capital punishment in the state of Georgia. And they said, no, you know, it's not enough. And so I don't think we can ignore empirical research. I think it's a critical component, but I think that we missed out if our conversation is only focused on crunching numbers. But it's really about having conversations with indigent defendants. And that's also where I think research should be going, my own included, is having conversations with people who have been accused of crime, who have been convicted or, you know, acquitted, but been through the system and advancing their voice and their experience in the adjudication process.
Sruithi, you want to? Oh, go ahead.
I can echo and chime in that I think to build off of the ideas from Professor Joe and Fordjour. I think using data and thinking about it beyond the quantitative data, particularly just not looking at data from certain case outcomes, such as bail outcomes or case disposition or recidivism, but really stepping back to thinking about like, how do you heal people? How do you heal communities that are impacted by incarceration and all of the trauma that this society has inflicted on these communities? So really thinking about that from an equity standpoint versus one particular, I think a lot of the research tends to focus on one type of intervention and how is that impacting these outcomes, but are not taking a critical look into the structure that maintains and reinforces oppression and racism. And so one is to really think about the questions, how do you address it from that standpoint, really focus on an equity-centered framework, and that one that's focused on recognizing, addressing, and dismantling some of these root conditions that are fueling mass incarceration and inequities. And then I get another thing that I've come across. So I am not trained in, I'm not a lawyer, nor was I my education in criminal justice or criminology. My background is public health. And through my work at RTI, I have kind of entered the indigent defense research space. And it's been really interesting in learning about the different frameworks that are there versus in public health. And I just think that there are some really important opportunities to kind of apply some multidisciplinary frameworks that are really versed in social determinants of health, really understanding how, thinking of the criminal legal system as its own ecology, and thinking about the health, the social, the mental health, the family connections of those who are just involved, and then the role that these system actors play into this, including defense attorneys and the larger courts. From the work I've done so far, there's a very siloed perspective that this is prosecutor focused, this is defense focused, and the courts. Then when you bring them together, there is that contention about who is the decision maker, who is the authoritative voice, and often the people who are most affected are absent from that. So really bringing in as many of those different perspectives, triangulating and really thinking through how do you identify an authoritative voice, who is the leader, how do you triangulate the results? So from the beginning all the way through the end, really redesigning how we think about building a research project. And the last part of that is just thinking about the system actors that are being researched. Are we really talking to the chiefs of offices? How much are we engaging the front line attorneys, the staff supports, the different folks that are in the courthouse? Really just thinking through who you're speaking to and how they are involved in the project from the beginning to the end.
Beautifully said by everyone. I don't think that I would have that much more to add, but I think one additional point I may share is that I think what everybody has been talking about so far is bringing together this interdisciplinary approach to what empirical research can look like and who's at the table when we're doing empirical research. And I myself come from a social work and public policy background. And so that's how I kind of came to the space. It wasn't that I as well was necessarily going to be trained as a lawyer, but did see the importance of being in this space and doing research within this space. And I think one perspective that social work can also offer, though social work has its own kind of set of concerns that I've experienced as well, is kind of a little bit more of what Dr. Embry was talking about with, being on the ground with folks who are experiencing the system and being able to ask some of those questions, especially our social workers of color who are experiencing multiple things as they're providing, the service. And so I think that some of those questions that can be asked and what we kind of draw the lines around who can do empirical research and what kind of technical background you can have to participate and have legitimacy in doing empirical research can be an area of focus as well.
Before we move to the next question, I want to kind of address some themes that were pulled out here, and starting with Irene's first comment about looking at how doing this work impacts the people working in the system, and drawing the thread to Venita's comment that it's not just about the system actors when we're talking about defendants, but what this does to families and communities. We received a comment that, there are some authoritative voices that have responded positively to research on racial disparity in their work. And there's a specific mention that the Washington Supreme Court did respond positively to this. And I wonder how affirmations or affirmed systems changes, what you guys think that impact might be on system actors working in this space, particularly people of color, and on our burnout rates, on our ability to feel like our research or our questions in the space have validity, or not necessarily validity because they are valid, but have impact. Before we move to the next question, anyone have any initial comments?
I'm happy to jump in and just say, I mean, anytime you can point to something as an external validation of the sort of the difficulties that you're feeling inside, it's always going to be good. I think one of the things we have to be cautious about and going forward whenever you've received anything like that is that it's not just a one and done, that there's not any sort of performative politics to it all. And I'll say, as someone that appreciates and values and working with and speaking to so many public defenders at so many different public defender offices, that's often a theme I hear from the disappointed employees that are either leaving the office or considering how to leave, right? That's also the same sort of words I'll hear from scholars of color who would want to pursue this type of work, but don't get the sort of national or organizational support that you would expect to be given to those who are asking really important questions of the criminal process that are informed by their experience, their lived experience as a person of color. So I say all that to say, it's always nice to be able to look at something as a piece of a success, but it can sometimes add to greater disappointment, anger, frustration, and even confusion when it ends up being it maintains just as a small piece and not part of something larger.
I would add that I definitely think the burnout happens. I know this happens. I hear this happens for defense attorneys, and it definitely happens for researchers of color. And I think that the biggest thing that happens there is when the institution doesn't change, but they want the diversity. They are, promoting diversity, but there's no change in the practices. So what happens is, especially in the research community, really eager young researchers of color are ready to make changes. They're ready to mentor. They're ready to take on these initiatives, but they're still held to the exact same standards as their white colleagues. So they're almost having to do this extra work that often doesn't get counted the same way as the traditional pipeline. So, you are sacrificing your career advancement for something that you feel very passionate about that ultimately doesn't get recognized by the institution. So there has to be a institutional change in order to really support folks who are really interested in diversifying and strengthening the pipeline of researchers and defense attorneys of color, and just doing this work in a more thoughtful way. We're going to get to some of the other places where you can strengthen it, but really, I think that the main thing I just feel is that there has to be an acknowledgement of there has to be a different practice that's at play. We can't be held to the same checklist and be expected to do more when often folks are coming in as first generation and are navigating this field also for first time. I am one of those people. I had to navigate my different degree programs on my own and figure out, how do I create a research portfolio that speaks to me and my community that I come from. So I'll pause it there.
That's actually a great place to pause because it's getting into our next question. And it's basically what can the research community do to increase the diversity of voices present And just as a push for this conversation, I'll remind us that in our pre-meetings, we talked, some of this was about pipelining and like how soon we need to start pushing people into the space and its visibility as a possible career choice for scholars of color when they're coming into the space, just as a pusher. It's not the thing, but so you guys can remember kind of where some of these conversations went.
Yeah, when can we start? Yesterday? I think about, and I can speak by my own process, making a transition from practice into academia. And it's a mystery for people who don't have maybe academics in their family or, were plucked and identified during law school as being on this sort of trajectory to becoming a law professor. And the barriers to entry are significant and varied. And for so many people, this idea of leaving sort of practice to then transition into a short-term fellowship to develop sort of scholarly writing, which is essentially your currency when you go on the academic market, to then land in, one of these tenure track jobs. And, for people that have been practicing for 5, 10 or more years to pay off the loans from law school, and then, they see that, oh, there's this great opportunity that I could have mentorship and guidance and be at a law school as a fellow, but the pay is $40,000. And for many people, paying back loans, potentially have started a family, sort of navigating big picture life decisions, to take, a significant pay cut like that isn't possible unless maybe you're partnered with someone who can support you or you're independently wealthy. And so I've talked to a lot of emerging hopeful scholars of color who just don't see a pathway possible. And I've sort of taken stock anecdotally, but many opportunities are just impossible for people to make given the financial barrier. And there is an assumption somehow that, if this is something you want to do, surely you can, survive a year or two in a fellowship making less than half your pay. And again, that's just not possible. And so there are some limited funding opportunities, but it often requires people to, teach or do things that would detract then from the writing. And it's just, I think for a lot of scholars of color, many of us, myself included, who came from under-resourced backgrounds that don't have a financial safety net, it's virtually an impossible sort of jump to make. And we're missing out on people who have incredible professional and personal life experiences that would fully enhance the research that's being completed.
Yeah, I completely agree with Alexis. I think one of the problems we run into when we think about how to diversify this space is that we think about how to diversify the pipeline, right? And I understand that it's one element of what we're trying to do here, but it can't just be about that pipeline. If you only focus on the pipeline, you are just reinforcing the traditional pathways to this, which are necessarily going to exclude, a number of people who would really increase the type of work that we want being done in this space. I myself, and as Alexis pointed out, we came from practice backgrounds, which going into the, academia and the research part is sort of, I'll say very frankly, it was very much frowned down upon, and the conversations you would have to have with people about the quality and the importance of your work. Sometimes it still surprises, some of my students when I talk about how difficult the process was because of that, and sort of, doing all that and navigating the path to tenure. So I just, when we think about diversifying, I just want us to consider that there's so many different ways that somebody can develop an interest in wanting to do this research, and so many different times in their life they might want to do it. And it's our job, if we truly mean this, to really explore and figure out ways to make those possible. I tell everybody hands down, I'd never ever thought about being a researcher or professor for a number of reasons, including I'd never had one, that looked like me or had my experience. And then when I spoke with my father, my Nigerian immigrant father, about going to get a PhD, the first thing he said was, how is that going to contribute to the household finances? That's just, let's be real, right? What can contribute is if you go become a doctor or a lawyer or an engineer or, these things. And I say that it was, God's timing for me to end up with the New Orleans Public Defenders, which was an office that was being built from scratch in the wake of Hurricane Katrina, where I started having all these questions about why was the office operating this way? Why was it so difficult to retain people of color who wanted to do the work in that office? And then it was a friend of mine who said, that's what law professors, researchers do. They ask those questions and they figure out these answers. And I was fortunate enough to go through a fellowship program at UCLA with support from my family who had reached a stage where they didn't need any sort of that kind of financial support for me to do that. But so that's just, that was a different path. And I think sort of more like Alexis and others, there are other people coming through different paths that we really need to find and support.
Yeah, I definitely agree with everything that you all said. And obviously I can't speak to the perspective of coming law to this field, but I think within even the research community, there are a lot of those same questions and kind of barriers to being able to participate. And I think one that's particularly salient, as we've kind of already been talking about, is this divide between qualitative research and quantitative research. And as someone who started out in the social sciences, having a lot of these questions about how to better the communities that I came from and what was happening with them, there's a very clear distinction in who was seen as doing, research that would get you on a path to be, in the academy or, publishing in journals. And that was very much quantitative work. And anytime that I brought up qualitative work, it was very much frowned upon and people didn't really feel like that was contributing to a conversation. And so I think that since then, the research community generally, I think, has come a long way in validating the importance of qualitative research, but kind of getting to that place often requires someone to have a quantitative background to say, I can do that too, but I'm going to focus on the qualitative piece. And I think that, as I kind of mentioned earlier, there's different spaces where people are developing so many important skills to ask questions and can later develop some of those quantitative skills if needed, like the field of social work, like the field of public policy, where you can understand statistics and numbers, but you don't have to be the one creating those numbers necessarily to be able to speak to them and to speak to the importance of them. And so I think in my experience, being a mixed methods researcher has been extremely important, partially because I think if I could, I'd probably spend a lot more time doing qualitative research, but for people to take a researcher seriously in the research community, you often have to speak to some of those other credentials, unfortunately. So I think being able to, like Professor Joe and Hoag-Fordjour just said, kind of being creative in who we're bringing along and kind of creating pathways that don't necessarily look like those traditional pipelines. And I think an example of that is with the Center for Justice Innovation. It was one of the few organizations when I was looking for a job out of grad school that kind of celebrated doing both, wanted to be on the ground and wanted to be doing some of the kind of traditional research. So I think finding more of those spaces, creating more of those spaces where people can move between different spaces and that's celebrated is definitely a part of the research community's call to action, I think, as well.
I would add, definitely, as I mentioned before, my pathway has not been a straight shot to indigent defense research, but my experiences have just working with a lot of great mentors, many of whom were white, who understood the importance of having students of color who are a part of their research project, who is co-designing the research project, understanding if we are interviewing a population that is mostly people of color, that you should have interviewers who can help reflect that. So that was actually the first few projects, was I was a research assistant straight out of undergrad, working and conducting surveys with folks who are returning to their community who had a history of substance abuse, and going into their homes and conducting those surveys, and just, I don't know, that felt like an immediate desire to connect and humanize them, and not just focus on the questions that were on the computer screen, but understand that they're, having these huge life events, and we're trying to capture this really specific element of them. And then that led me to graduate school to get my MPH to work on a qualitative study of women with incarcerated partners, primarily African-American women in the Southeast. And it was just amazing to hear these women, often mothers, talk about how they're navigating their relationship with their partners, their families who may or may not know their partner's incarcerated, including their children, and how they're just handling a lot of the stress, shouldering a lot of the stressed financial burdens, and often putting themselves behind so that their partner and their children can have some feeling of normalcy and a regular relationship. And so that kind of continued, and then I applied to RTI and just worked with a wide range of people who were doing work in behavioral science, and working with communities in the public health space. And I just kind of stumbled into some projects that, allowed me to work, and, some of it was more the data parts. And as I worked on the data, cleaning data sets for projects related to the criminal legal system, some of our projects there, just be able to take more initiative, but again, working under folks who can help me with the understanding of how the system develops. And then I was able to bring in some of my own knowledge about qualitative research and my lived experiences. I'm from Birmingham, Alabama, and it's just coming from a place that is still very segregated in a very not well discussed way. I have always tried to bring authenticity to the projects, and I've always appreciated that those who I worked under have been willing to hear from me and incorporate my perspectives into that. And even now, when I do qualitative interviews, it is always very interesting when I'm talking to other people we're talking with. And I'm proud of you, from people I've talked to 2 minutes in. And I feel like there is a need for continuing to have a really strong diversity in our research teams, and also people who are willing to say, we need to pause. Are we really just focusing on outcomes or data? We're just going through the motions of our research project, but really what are we trying to impact? So I've always just been appreciative of the folks who I've worked with, who have given me a space to take that leadership. And one thing I would love to see more in a space like public health, there are so many students of color who really don't know how to jump into the criminal legal system research. We're so focused on health, but all of those frameworks just really tie into, the psychology of the criminal legal system. And I would love to see more interaction between those two spaces, as well as other areas like social work and public policies and sociology.
I want to stay there for a minute to kind of expand on this, because it's a theme that we've come across, is that we've got this exposure to this space. We as people of color grew up, I am a justice involved person with a person my father was in prison growing up. And this idea of looking at how indigent defense research and services is done and services are provided was something new to me, even after I started practicing, right? It wasn't this obvious place for research and division, even though we were probably asking the questions. We didn't know there were these formal spaces to ask these questions, and there was these areas of research where we could do this research in places that gave us the space to do it. And so I guess from everyone here is what can we do to kind of amplify the work that's already being done? What needs to happen in organizations like IDRA and other spaces that amplifies the work of scholars of color, and those and the types of work or the types of positions that can be helpful for people who want to do this work. What can we do, or what should we do? Is that our role? Should we be telling other people what's our role in making visible the public defense space, and the importance of amplifying the work that's already out there?
Citing to each other.
I know.
Yeah, I mean, that's really the way to do it. I mean, there are these lists circulated of who are the most, cited scholars, and it tends to be some of it's, scholarship production and amount of time they've been producing, but it tends to skew older, whiter, and almost exclusively male. And as I go about my research, I find that I'm often turning to sort of younger, and I don't even mean chronologically younger, but voices that are more recent in sort of publishing, because they tend to direct me to some of the most unexpected, exciting areas of research. And many of them happen to be people of color. Sean Osei-Uwasu, who I know we've talked about already, and his scholarship is cited in the chat box, I think is producing some of the most impactful, dynamic, necessary research on, and many of it's historical and linking to present day, but on the development of indigent defense, on the development of public defense. And he's not the first person to talk about the history of public defense, but he's one of the first people to talk about it as being tethered to this arc of racial discrimination in the criminal adjudication system. Who is being prosecuted, who is subject to prosecution and incarceration, and how has that then impacted how it is that we deliver indigent defense services. And to me, it's, what Sean is saying is based on information that has always been around. He's just saying it in a new and necessary way. And I think about, his own early experience and exposure. I think he was interning at Bronx Defenders. He's from the Bronx. And I find that I routinely cite to his work as opposed to, other Sixth Amendment historians.
Yeah, I mean, I couldn't say it any better than Alexis. I guess the one thing I'll add that I think an organization like IDRA can do, in addition to amplifying the work of different scholars of color, like Sean and Tinu and all those, is that you could also, there has to be work put to make your space a safe space for discussion of new, young, malformed, unformed, early, ideas that can be really fostered and incubated in a way that, just for that, right? Because, anytime I hear, my friendship with Sean, my friendship with Tinu, my ability to turn to them and get their feedback on my projects, to share my feedback on their projects, it all came from, we're part of the same colloquium, a group of scholars that works with young scholars of color that are trying to enter into legal academy, and they provided a safe space for us to talk about what we wanted to research and how we wanted to get there, and helped us develop it and feel confident and secure in it. And so when we get to celebrate these works once they're published, we can't ignore the fact that they came from a place of being able to talk with really esteemed scholars very openly and honestly from an early stage. And so I think that's one thing that IDRA could really think about how to do, in addition to amplifying the products as well. And also in the process of amplifying, right, be aware that it's not, again, just a one and done or a 2 or 3 and done, or even, from certain schools or certain places or certain scholars. One of my favorite things I've been able to do post tenure now, and again, through the traditional process of tenure, I didn't feel quite secure enough to do this then, but post tenure, every time, I get a request to submit to a symposium, I speak to some of the students that I work with who I've had great conversations about different research ideas, and then team up with them to write something, right? And they're wonderful. They know what they're doing, and what they'll say afterwards is, I never would have thought that, you know, I could write something like this, right? And thank you for giving me the opportunity to explore that, whether or not they go off and become law professors or researchers or any of that, you know, who knows? But I do know that they're going to go off into the world with and feeling you know, an inherent value to their work that they may not have had, or their ideas about how things should improve, or the questions that should be asked and what solutions are acceptable that they may not have had without sort of that opportunity.
I would echo everything that's been shared, and it also feels very reflective of my own experience. One thing I would add to that is that I'm a person of color, clearly, and I also have my own lived experience, but sometimes I feel like the trainings that are available are very centered towards those who have not thought too deeply or learned too deeply on racism and implicit bias. And I often feel like there's a gap for some folks who need more of the advanced understanding about how you can continue to incorporate equity into the work that we're doing, how to make sure we're thinking about that. Sometimes I, enter a training and very excited, and if I'm one of the only two or few people of color, you can feel that the energy and the talking points sometimes shift. And so there needs to be those spaces that people of color, Black folks can really, work together and share those ideas, but also places where there could be those exchange and collaboration. So just multiple and different types of spaces to learn, to be open, to collaborate, are just some areas where I feel like are really missing, especially with that multidisciplinary approach. And then also just to amplify a group at RTI, there's recently RTI has invested in a group that's called TRUES, the Transformational Research Unit on Equity, where mostly some of our Black researchers who came out of this criminal justice space have created a research group. And there's a publication they recently developed that talked about the research process, both as the researcher, how you approach research, and the questions you're asking, and thinking about it from not just diversity, so not just having different voices, but how do you move through the steps of inclusivity, belonging, equity, and then eventually to transformation and liberation. And I feel like sometimes we get so focused on the diversity parts of things that I guess it gets lost in how do you make sure that the inclusivity and that belonging, ultimately continues to manifest and grow into these more equity-centered perspectives. So I'm happy to share the link to that. I think it's an amazing resource and something that can be applied in for those who have different levels of knowledge about equity.
So before we move to that last major question, I want to kind of throw in something here, is that as we're talking, it's been through the thread of what we've been saying, is that oftentimes we're in these spaces where we're the onlys. Unless we make a deliberate effort to create a group like TRUE, scholars of color or researchers, lawyers, attorneys, we're often in this space where we're in it. It's majority white. It's majority white. And so there's this fear that there's something about the way that we do this work that reifies racial segregation, so that people who are, Andy mentioned it in his opening statement, is that criminal justice is seen as this diverse space, but we've all noticed it, like who's in the courtroom and where they're in the courtroom and where they're in these offices and in these spaces and who has the authoritative voice and things like that. So we've got these questions about how do we change that? How do we stop reifying us, or how do we stop these spaces from continuing to look like all white spaces and authoritative voices and spaces? And then, we are literally splattering the color in these spaces. Does that start with hiring committees? Does that start, what do hiring committees who are trying to diversify these spaces, what do they need to start looking for and asking for? What needs to move out of the spaces that might be reifying segregated spaces or all white spaces?
I'll start here. That's a great question. Sort of like the ultimate sort of, okay, where do we go from here? Sort of question. And then the reason I jumped to answer is, I teach at UC Davis School of Law, and our dean, Kevin Johnson, he wrote a great piece a few years back when I was hired, because we are, a majority minority law school faculty, which is no easy accomplishment. And he sort of talked about the steps that they followed to get there. And some of those will sound sort of very obvious, I think, to those of us who have thought about how to diversify spaces in a meaningful and long-term way. He talks about how it was support from the hires up, and not just, performative or just verbal support, sort of putting your money where your mouth is, putting your energy where your mouth is, in terms of, this is a goal for us, here's why, and this is how we're going to do it. And here's a timeline that we're going to use to determine if we need to come up with stronger steps to make it happen. Diversifying the decision-making groups, right? Because the tendency is, human nature is that we just sort of replicate ourselves. If the space is already all white, it's going to replicate itself. If the space is already, at a stage where it only thinks certain types of scholarship is, theoretically sound or important, it's going to replicate itself in terms of when it's looking for that type of scholarship again. So how to diversify it and all that. Develop, learning how to sort of make sure you get into different spaces as an organization, so that you can receive and experience, different the different research and publications that are going out of there, and then creating sort of diverse shortlists is how he did it. And then he also talks a lot about retention was a key factor, right? So you've got to do some studies about what the experience is like for the racial minorities that are a part of the organization, or who have been presenting their work there, and then and making sure that you are sensitive to any concerns that they may have had for themselves, or they may see going forward for others, right? Because the climate matters, as Kevin, my dean, would say, and you've got to do what you can to make sure it's a welcoming place, and that it's a place that people would want to stay involved in going forward.
And I just want to underscore how remarkable and possible what Dean Johnson did at Davis was. And for folks that aren't as familiar with the history of California, in 1996, the state voted to do away with affirmative action, and the number in sort of public setting, and the number of students of color, particularly Black and Latino students, plummeted in the entire UC system, and the climate was working against exactly what Dean Johnson, was prioritizing. And even though, it's been now 20 plus years since Prop 209 was passed, it's not impossible. And I think what I hear from, leaders or people on hiring committees is that, like, oh, we just don't see the applicants, or, where are these people, or, our hands are tied. But I think that's just such a powerful, and Irene, thank you so much for sharing that, particularly with the climate and the history, of California and its antagonism towards diversifying professional spaces in public institutions.
In that same vein, in the research area, there is that same question of where, we're responding. We can only interview those who are applying, and there's the questions of where are we recruiting and meaningfully recruit. It's one thing to, I'm in North Carolina. We have many HBCUs throughout the Southeast, and really thinking through, are we really tapping into the criminal justice programs, the law schools, sociology programs? And when we're there, how are students perceiving us? And that's an important question that I am interested in, is not, we can't just go there and have a job fair. One, if the jobs aren't there, people want to know, what kind of jobs can I apply to right now? And we're like, well, we're not really sure. That doesn't help. Again, you have to think about it. Many are first gens and are trying to navigate this world on their own, thinking about their career options. The tech world is very strong and very persuasive nowadays. So how do you get people into the attorney areas or into the research areas? How do we show our value as like an RTI or other institution to get people to understand, like, not only if you go on our website, you might see it is predominantly white, but how do we let you know that this is a safe space? And that is areas where I think it's really important for institutions to recognize that just having a position where you say diversity is important, or we care about, working with marginalized communities enough, you have to be able to demonstrate that and make sure that folks feel like when they get there, they're not going to get tokenized and made to feel they're just a number, but ultimately you have to play ball. So as an organization, as an institution, you have to reprioritize what you want and see the value in diversity. And then just the overall funding mechanism and be able to push back. We are soft money companies, so we go after external grants, and really starting, as we reiterated before throughout this presentation, is the need to break down the silos. I like to see you all as friendly competitors, but someone we can always collaborate with and we can learn from each other. I think the traditional mechanism is, this is our work, we have an opportunity, how do we make sure to get it from somebody else? And sometimes the answer is that person, other group can do this work better, and being able to step aside and learn from each other and work together. Yes, it's starting to rain down, so I apologize if my internet becomes spotty.
I also think about these opportunities that exist, like at Wisconsin Law School, for instance, with the Hasty Fellowship, which is specifically earmarked to increase diversity from underrepresented groups in the legal academy. Kimberly Crenshaw was a Hasty Fellow. And, when we think about that as a launch pad, so it's earmarked, it's slated for to increase diversity, and it's a 2-year fellowship, provides mentorship, support, funding, support for scholarship. There needs to be more opportunities for that. And the money is there. It's just, how do we prioritize that? But that's something that could exist, at various institutions, research, and at law schools, if it's, got to be law related. But I just think about how critical programs like that are. And then, once you do hire someone of color, this has come up already with sort of this need for retention, to actually compensate people for the additional labor that they're doing. And so I think about the fact that, yes, I have, my sort of formal service requirements as a professor at my law school. But then I find that many students who are underrepresented, whether through disability, first gen, students of color, a combination of all of the above, come to me. And I want to make myself available to them for all sorts of sort of informal mentorship, and to make sure that we're compensating people who come from underrepresented groups. We hire because they're underrepresented. We expect them to be available and to be a resource for underrepresented students, but there needs to be either financial compensation or research leave provided, so that people can, filling these roles, feel valued, will stay and continue to produce good work across the board with service, teaching, and scholarship.
I agree with everything that was said. I think the only thing that I would add, I think on the note of retention, is opportunities to develop a capacity for different skills that are made available within organizations is incredibly important, I think, because if we're talking about, attracting people from very different fields who may still be able to contribute to this one, one of them that I think is really important is that opportunity to both allow a person to lead projects, but also develop new skills. So the example I'm thinking about specifically is the team that I'm on within the Center for Court Innovation, which is a very small but mighty team. And half of our team is intentionally people who are lawyers who are previously practicing in the field. And then the other half is kind of traditional researchers, but obviously I don't come from a traditional research background, so that looks a little different too. And I think the value of that is I've learned so much about the field of public defense from an attorney who previously was practicing in that field. And that's very much where we were getting our research questions from. And, able to kind of also share my skills with research to the formerly practicing attorney so that they could also gain the capacity to go after funding opportunities wherever they went next, even if they didn't stay at our institution. So I think that kind of creating these spaces that allows for skill sharing and, the opportunity to lead projects similarly can do a lot of great work in diversifying the field. And within research specifically, I'm sure a lot of us have already heard about participatory action research or action research. And that's really an opportunity to really invest in non-traditional models of research where you're involving people from community. And again, that's an opportunity to build different skills in the process of being a part of the research and also being able to use it, in real time without kind of waiting for that long, arduous process that like research and publishing is often tied to, which can also prevent us from having the type of impact that we want to have in the work that we're doing. So yeah, I think those are the only things that I would add.
I want to stay with something that Alexis brought up that's actually pretty important in the space where we're talking about being compensated for invisible labor. There's probably a question in people's heads like, why should I compensate you for something I don't know you're doing or I don't quite understand? And so for everyone in your own experiences, what do we mean when we're talking about invisible labor? Why should it be compensated? How much time is it really? And it's, even if it's not time, for me, it's mental. It's a mental load. And anyone want to be more specific about what that means, like the types of invisible labor, not just in the academy and in research spaces, but definitely in research spaces, but also we have some public defenders or training coordinators in the room also who still work in public defense. So Alexis and Irene, especially when you guys were working in public defender offices, what was some of the invisible labor in those spaces that we need to be aware of, or people need to be aware of in the room?
Yeah, I spoke a little bit about it in academia, but in practice, working for a government agency, to start with, just to situate sort of my experience, 4 to 5% of lawyers are Black. And it's even less, I think, in public defense, depending on the jurisdiction. And so, I was working with exclusively men who had been sentenced to death in the state of Tennessee. And over half of my client population were Black men. About half of, or slightly more than half of death row in Tennessee is Black, despite the fact that, Black people make up a far less percentage of the population there. But I found that I was often relied on as just being a cultural sort of translator for my colleagues. Or, if they had problems, connecting with their clients, which happens over the course of any attorney-client relationship, and happens sort of over a longer period of time during capital post-conviction representation, but sort of being asked to visit with or be the go-between temporarily between, another sort of defense team, even though I wasn't the primary attorney on that team, the sort of conversations, sort of consultations that I would be asked to have, with outreach to maybe clients' family or in their community. And, in many ways as a young attorney, I was eager to play these roles. And, it was a great learning process for me. But in retrospect, I realized, I was being asked to do things that my colleagues weren't asked to do. And there needed to be different sort of decision-making happening, different sort of compensation, but a sort of a greater awareness from the leadership in that office of, what I was being asked to do.
Yeah, I would just add that exactly is right. But then there's also the sort of the added emotional, mental, and physical work of being a source of support for the few other colleagues of color there as well, right? Who can't turn to leadership or anybody else to help them navigate their own experiences as a person of color dealing with this, right? So I was, Rihanna just performing Super Bowl, so I was talking to my dearest friend, Chaz Arnett. We work together. He's a researcher now at the University of Maryland. And I told, I reminded him about how, when we were both public defenders in New Orleans, my theme song for him was Rihanna's Umbrella, because anytime I had some sort of issue where I felt like somebody was, there was something wrong, I was able to go to him for support. I imagined that leadership in the office would have described themselves as being as having a supportive role for me, but they weren't ones I could approach with those sort of conversations, right? And that was a load for Chaz, and I'm always really grateful and thankful that he took it, right? But he wasn't getting compensated for the work that he did in keeping me at that office and doing the work that they wanted me to do, right? In the academic setting, you run into that as well, right? I'm very fortunate to be at Davis, like I said, which, as a pre-tenure person in a majority minority faculty, I had a number of people I could turn to whenever I was facing that kind of stuff. So people didn't have to carry as much, but it could still be really heavy. I remember giving a talk at one point where, I was sort of attacked on all sides with in ways, very racially motivated sort of overtones and undertones. And, leaving the room and immediately running into my dean, Kevin, who, gathered other people around, and we all just sort of talked about it. They had experienced themselves, navigating the market, and it was just a safe space to talk, right? But it was time out of their day. It was energy for them. There's the emotional toll of having to sort of re-experience what they experienced as they're trying to help me walk through it. And none of them were getting paid for that. But I was very grateful for it.
For me, and many of those same things, kind of the invisible labors, the mentorship, I have always, as I went through my PhD program, I knew I was not going to enter academia because I, one, have no passion for teaching, but then also the stress of working with folks who I have to be required to work with versus selectively mentoring. I love mentoring folks, junior staff, but I need to know that you are ready and you're ready to put in the work. And I've worked with many more junior staff at RTI and also through the graduate program, folks who are just really interested. So that time I have had so many calls of folks, Black students who are interested in RTI. I'm always willing, if I meet them at a conference, talking with them, giving them my insight on how I got into RTI in this field, other way around, RTI employees who want to go back to graduate school. I probably have a couple conversations a month with different folks who are interested, and I'm the referral person for going back to graduate school, and I worked for the most time while I was completing my doctorate. But also what I've noticed that I do on my projects that I'm currently leading is that I am very protective about how we're creating data collection instruments and who is the interviewer. If I've had studies where if I know that there is primarily interviewing people of color, Black individuals, I'm the only Black person on the team, I will be doing the interviews. A lot of it is just how we approach it. How do you give people the space to be listened to? There is a frequency and I've seen other times where people just go through the questions or get very irritated that it doesn't start on time. And that's just not something I want to bring into the projects that I lead. So I take on more responsibility because I have that desire to make sure people are humanized, not to say my coworkers cannot do it, but I take on that additional like mental and emotional responsibility. I also do a lot of work on EDIB, we call it EDIB, the equity, diversity, inclusion, belonging work at RTI. I've been involved in a lot of our initiatives, helping out with surveys within our company. And it's just also the mental labor of how much I can complain to people, how we need to do more. I thankfully have amazing supervisors who listen to me complain, and we strategize and we create ideas. But there are sometimes I realize, is this a battle that I can continue to fight for? How much is my pushback going to now start to negatively impact? Like, I have to be very thoughtful about being the complainer and what my image looks like, and how the work that I'm doing, all these other service projects, how that might impact my larger career and opportunities. So there is a lot of balancing I do on a fairly daily basis about how much I can push and what responsibilities do I have to do or can I do that is separate from what my other colleagues are doing? And then just generally for paper writing, intellectually, I need more support. There is a need for folks like on this panel to really think through those from a different conceptual level. RTI has a great space. We have lots of different areas, disciplines, and great people who are really great researchers, but sometimes there is that need for to really think through this area. This area of indigent defense specifically is fairly new to us. So really being able to talk through what is the current practices and how do we also just reimagine this entire research area.
Yeah, definitely agree with everything that's been shared. I think that's, I don't know, I think the more that I'm hearing everyone on the panel speak, it just feels like, for me as well, it's just something that I think when you are part of the field and you kind of accept as something that you are going to carry with you. And part of that is the importance of mentorship and being able to have those personal connections and those relationships in a way that the institutions that are around us, we can't always trust, are going to withhold and create for us. And so we create those spaces ourselves or look for them. And I think that's very much been my experience as well, navigating all of those spaces. I can think of, so many kind of opportunities that have been, I guess, kind of given more weight in the past few years that I haven't really seen within our organization as well, the Center for Justice Innovation. One of the first things that I really appreciated when I came was one of my colleagues who barely knew me just said, we're going to take a meeting and we're going to talk. And she said, you can ask me anything you want as it relates to race, and as it relates to just like being a researcher of color within this organization. And I just got to talk really frankly with someone that I didn't really know. And she was very open about the history of the work that was being done at the center. So I think transparency among my colleagues of color has been one of those huge kind of important aspects of being able to be authentic and know the history and know what you're kind of walking into, and also being able to calculate for yourself, as everyone has shared in all these spaces that are really difficult, how much energy you want to put forth and how much it's actually going to carry into change. And so I think, being able to see through action what an organization does to respond to, the concerns that you rise to the top is important to you, is always like the most important thing for me. And I think one thing that's always really difficult is the balance, as Dr. Embry shared, of being able to kind of experience the hardship as a researcher of color, and then also being able to very kind of logically share a solution. Because if you come and you share that you've had this experience, if you're in an organization that's majority white, folks don't really know what to do with it. So there's a lot of burden put on the person of color as well to come up with a solution in a very strategic, but also actionable way. And I think that's been a skill that I've had to develop over the years. That's just really difficult, and I'm not really sure what the answer is. I think that's just a part of being a part of this space sometimes, unfortunately. So again, I think just echoing everything everyone has already said, I think mentorship is a huge part of it. Having a space where people can develop genuine relationships with someone who's not a superior, and be able to be real about what you're experiencing, and also just develop connections to other spaces outside of your organization that you might be able to look to if you feel like your organization isn't supporting you, I think are all really helpful examples. So everything that Venita has shared about RTI, that's really helpful for me to know as well, as I look to kind of things that I do in the future, and who I partner with in the future, different organizations. If they're not treating their researchers of color well, that's something to know. as we think about who we partner with in the future as well.
I want to step in here and ask a question that's related to this. We didn't talk about this in either of our pre-meetings, but I think it can be, can be really important. We've established that having researchers, professors, attorneys of color is necessary, especially when we set research agendas, when we're talking about, where the field is moving and where it will go. But then we're talking about what else helps scholars and researchers of color in these spaces. Here's another question about what are some of the violent, you can feel free not to answer because I'm asking about what can be traumatic experiences, but what are some of these violent situations that you've experienced that have made workplaces or organizations untenable, that have made them unwelcoming, that have made them difficult to retain these, that's made it difficult to retain Black women especially, or women especially, but also other scholars and researchers and attorneys of color. If you want to share what those are, or kind of what mainstream practices that we generally think are really, really good for a workplace, but actually really, really violent and bad for scholars and researchers of color as we think about doing this work. If you don't want to answer, again, you're free not to because it can be traumatic, but if you can think of particular practices that basically reify oppression and subjugation in the workplace, can be microaggressions, it can be actual specific kinds of behaviors that can help this group kind of grasp what it means when we say this is not a welcoming environment, it's not open, it's not safe. Specific examples you may have would be, I think, helpful.
I mean, I have one example of something that works to retain people. But before transitioning to academia, I worked at the NAACP Legal Defense and Educational Fund, and it's an organization explicitly started by Black lawyers to dismantle sort of racism and inequality for the benefit of all of society. And during the time that I was there, it was run by 2 Black women, and it's still run by 2 Black women. There's been a slight change in leadership. Sheila and Eiffel stepped down for other opportunities. And it was the first environment I'd been in where there was paid parental leave, 6 months. And I mean, it was having come from the federal government where there's no parental leave, and there's like explicit policies that you may not take off time you can only take off time to recover from childbirth, not to bond with the child, is explicitly at the time what the policy was at the federal defenders. And obviously this impacts all parents, not just people of color, not just women of color. But I think it was so stark for me that shifting sort of professional environments and the sort of supportive policies that exist at a workplace when the leadership is two black women.
I'm happy to share a couple of examples. I'll do one from practice that I think that that organizations or offices don't necessarily think about how harmful they can be. But the practice of attorneys get to choose their co-counsel and who they choose and why, right? Sometimes there's issues in terms of you not being chosen as co-counsel, or you're chosen because what they think of as a compliment. You're going to connect well with the clients. You're going to speak very well to the client, sort of minimizing your role as one of the attorneys of record, somebody with a law degree, somebody that can speak, about the law and its application and what's required to the court, and not just about relating with other people of color in that role. So I think, places have to think about how they establish support or how they run the co-counseling process. In academia, this one's it's trickier because, when I think about the more difficult places I've had as an academic in the pre-tenure world, it was the conferences where you would present sort of a snapshot of your work, right? And then you'd have an audience who, they didn't read the work, they just, they just heard just a brief description of it. And their role was to help you grow the project, right? But often the comments and the words they would say would further sort of, diminish you in terms of like, did you deserve to be in that space? Or, oh, you just need more, you need more practice in this way, or you're making this argument because you don't know this. And, so I think one of the things that the academics or researchers need to be, sort of aware of is when you create those sort of short, small, hour-long discussions or workshops on pieces, be careful in not sort of overestimating your knowledge about the piece, the work that's already been done, the work that's being done, just because of the 15-minute description you've heard of it or the quick perusal through a draft that you might have done.
I can jump in terms of some of the violent experiences or things that are unwelcoming. This goes through graduate school. Sometimes those applications, those statements of your trauma and the burdens and hardships you had, any opportunity, any places where you're asking groups that have expressed like vulnerability or being vulnerable or marginalized to display their trauma in order to get access to an opportunity or just even in a training, and you are wanting to have people talk about and display the hardships and trauma that they've experienced. We have to stop doing that. There should be spaces for people to speak openly about their lived experiences, both the privilege and disadvantage perspectives people have, but asking people to explicitly talk about their trauma. There was a situation I've heard people who've asked Black colleagues or Black researchers, have your partner ever been arrested, stopped and frisked, or, been, pulled over by the cops? It's like, well, I don't know which answer is that you want to hear. If the answer is no, are you basically minimizing the impact that this is happening in the Black community? If the answer is yes, how is that changing anything? Other colleagues have mentioned to work on some of the federal projects, they have to disclose that they have a family member who is incarcerated. They feel like that is only asked of them. They're the only person on these projects for years that have had to make that disclosure, and it feels like an element of being singled out. And then to Professor Joe's point about asked to be the person of color voice, it's great to, as a service project, to be on this hiring committee and things like that. But sometimes when you're asked, because we need that person, a person of color on the hiring committee, it does feel tokenizing. So being able to way of having people authentically be part of the process, because there is an importance of having diversity and the inclusiveness and the belonging, just really thinking about how you frame that. And then the solution is just transparency. For a lot of some of the work that I felt that has kind of transformed things is being transparent about how decisions are being made, the process. I don't need to see every step, but just understanding how different perspectives were incorporated in order to reach a decision, and that people have the opportunity to give feedback.
Yeah, definitely agree with everything that everyone has shared. I think it's what first came to mind is something that we were talking about earlier, which is being really mindful of spaces that use a lot of inclusive language, but in practice might be treating their employees very differently. So I've had experiences where sometimes it's the spaces that are actually not new to the conversation about race. They've been grappling with that conversation for a very long time, but there may be internalized racism. There might be ways that the organization, I guess, is somewhat. I'm trying to be really careful not to name a specific example or an organization, but that kind of speaks to it and does a lot of really great work as it relates to perceptions of really great work in the public about what being focused on racial equity looks like, and pushing for policies or advocating for work that does really push the work forward, but internally treating their employees very differently. and not being able to foster an environment that really takes care of their employees, especially their researchers of color. So I think that kind of process of someone kind of somewhat trusting that an organization cares about, all of the things that we've talked about, but then getting there and, having to experience the turmoil of grappling with what the public perception is, and then what they were told prior to coming, and then experiencing being at the organization themselves, I think can be incredibly violent. So I'll just stop there.
Thank you, Sruithi. We're coming up on the half hour at the end of this conversation. We want to thank everyone for their very thoughtful questions and for their time, and for our panelists for taking the time to do this twice, and for being so open and thoughtful about your concerning these questions, about your experiences, about where you see the field moving, and where you see the most value in the field. Before we close out, I want to remind everyone, it's in the chat. IDRA does have its second virtual spring conference coming up in April 26th to 28th. There's a link to sign up if you want to present at one of the panels. And I don't think, I can be corrected, but I do think that it's open to works in progress. You don't have to have finished your research, but if you have enough for a presentation, I think you can submit. Yes, works in progress are open to the spring conference. And the Deason Center, if we have upcoming programs, we do have a criminal justice workshop coming up with Professor Justin Murray in 2 weeks. And please look at Deason Center .smu.edu and look under our events to see other upcoming events. We do have an upcoming book talk with Venita Beatty about her book, Manifested Justice. And then we have an upcoming small tribal and rural criminal justice event with Michelle Stats coming up in April. So please take a moment to look on our website and get caught up on our upcoming programming. Again, I want to thank our panelists. If they have any closing thoughts, now's the time to share. If there is anywhere, you guys are free to speak on anywhere where you see hope coming up, or if you want to leave with a parting thought that you want people to stick with or think about moving forward in their work, this is the time to do it. And I'm good. You guys have put out a lot today, so you don't have to say anything, but you've got a parting thought. This is the time.
I just wanted to say how incredibly grateful I am to share this panel with all three of you. It's just been amazing, and I'm so grateful to hear your wisdom over the course of previous conversations that we've had, but even in this one. So
yeah, I'm grateful to be here with all of you having this conversation. And I had a reporter reach out to me about a case that was argued before Massachusetts High Court, where a defense attorney had made explicitly racist and Islamophobic comments about his client. And the attorney posted these things publicly, which is rare to have that kind of smoking gun evidence. But the reporter and I talked about just the lack of research in this area, of the impact of bias, implicit and obviously explicit, can have on an indigent person who can't choose their lawyer on their experience. So I'm just grateful for IDRA for having this conversation.
Thank you for the invitation. And as a person who is growing research in this area, I really love to continue to be engaged with you all and IDRA. Thank you for having me.
I'll just join in the chorus of thanks, and I'll just say I hope this is really just the start of the conversation and the effort. I think I'm sure we all get exhausted when things that are just performative, but it's only performative if nothing happens after it. It's just to return to business as usual. And so I'm really excited and looking forward to what you as an organization do to sort of increase the racial disparity, to reduce the lack of racial minorities involved in IDRA. And I just encourage, as you do the work, as you continue to ask the questions and try to figure out solutions, that Please don't get frustrated if it takes a long time. As I was talking with a prosecutor yesterday, he was talking a lot about all the programs they're trying to put in their office. I just tried to remind him, real lasting and important change, any type of meaningful growth is not going to be comfortable or easy. So just really lean into the discomfort of it all as much as possible, because it's really important.
Actually, that's a really great note to end on. Lean into the discomfort of it all. It's a long process. It's uncomfortable, but we all deserve it. We all deserve that extra effort by organizations like these, and the people who make up, members of this organization make up offices and workplaces and research teams across the country. So it's very important. I did just post the IDRA link in the chat. There are people who in the space who are already in IDRA, but if there's anyone who's interested in joining the IDRA listserv, learning more about IDRA programming, and learning more about the monthly list of indigent difference research to look at, that can be found on the IDRA webpage. I just posted it again in the chat. Use that link to join the listserv so you can hear more about scholarship and research and hear more about what the organization is doing. So thank you all so much. We will see you next month at Deason's next events. Have a great afternoon and a great weekend. I'm gonna leave it up if people want to grab the chat really quickly. I think everyone, if you want to, can save the chat. There's a lot of resources there. There's a button in the chat that should let you save it. I'm gonna leave it up just for a second in case anyone wants to grab it. All right, I think that should be it.
That was amazing, Kenitra.
All right, thank you, Andy. I'm gonna close it now. I was just trying to make sure anyone who wanted to grab the chat had the time to grab it.
Yeah, all good.
All right.
Thank you so much. That could have gone better. Appreciate you.
Thank you, Andy. Have a great weekend.
You too.